Good day, everyone. Welcome to another Live with Kevin. Glad you're here on our sort of semi-normal time of a Monday at noon Eastern time. I don't know where that is, what time that is where you are, and you may not even be watching me live. I understand that as well. But if you're here live, I have a request, and that is that you start using your fingers and type in whatever social platform you're in the comments and just say hello and tell us where you're located. I would love that. My guests would love that as well. Sometimes you're a little shy and you don't share that. We'd love for you to do that if you would. And of course, if you're watching this later, you can do that, but I won't see it. We'll leave it at that. But it would be something that others who joined could see that along the way. But listen, we're so glad that you are here, regardless of where you are. And the other reason that I ask you, other than just to say hello so I know where you are, the other reason that I ask you to do that is that I want you to engage with us for the next little while. And so imagine if you were with Jonathan and I will introduce him in a second. Imagine if we were sitting around a table having a conversation and you were listening into the conversation that we were having. If you had a question, you would ask it. If you had a comment, you would share it. If you had an idea, you would offer it, right? That's what you would do. It would be a natural conversation. And so if you will do that here, it will be an even more natural conversation. And oh, by the way, it'll make a better podcast episode. Because yes, if you can see up over my shoulder, this will eventually be an episode of the Remarkable Leadership podcast. And if you share your questions, you might get them answered and you'll make a better podcast for all those in perpetuity that follow you. So that's how you can contribute. I hope that you'll do that. And with that, because this will also be a podcast, now I'm going to do the live read of the open. So sit back, get out your pen, get ready, and here we go. Marissa, this is in 3, 2, 1. Chances are, if you listen to this podcast, you strive to lead in a way other than command and control. That goal might even be at the heart of why you're here. Today, we're going to clarify what that alternative is, the alternative to command and control, and so that you can lead through rather than focusing on exhibiting power over others. Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, where we are helping leaders grow personally and professionally to lead more effectively and make a bigger positive difference for their teams, organizations, and the world. If you are listening to this podcast in the future, you could be with us live. Too late for this one, but not for future ones. And so you can learn about when those live episodes happen. Find out how you can get in front of some of these ideas, because we're recording this almost 2 months before it will go live. And so you can find out when we're doing those, how you can engage with us on any social media platform, but you can do that on our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. Just go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn. Shocking, to join us in one of those places and hopefully join us live in the future. Today's episode is brought to you by the second edition of our book, The Long Distance Leader, Revised Rules for Remarkable Remote and Hybrid Leadership. If you lead a team that is distributed in any way, this book will give you new skills, insights, and the confidence to lead more effectively in the new world of work. Learn more and order your copy today at remarkablepodcast.com/LDL. I hope that you will do that, and then I hope that you will virtually welcome in my guest as he joins us. His name is Jonathan Clark. He is a professor of management at the University of Texas at San Antonio, where he also served as department chair and associate dean. His work focuses on helping leaders create the conditions under which individuals, groups, and organizations can do their best collective work. He is the co-author, along with his accomplished father and sister, of Leading Through: Activating the Heart, Soul, and Mind of Leadership. He is our guest, and I'm glad to have him. Jonathan, welcome. Glad you're here.
Thank you, Kevin. Glad to be here.
So let's talk about, I want to talk about dad and sis in a minute, but I want to just talk about like a little bit about how it came to be that you are eventually really the three of you, but what sort of led, what's the storyline? You didn't probably wake up when you were 6 and say, I'm going to write a book. So like, give us just the really quick arc, how we end up here.
I didn't wake up when I was 6 thinking I'd write a book.
It was just a guess.
But actually the impetus for the book does stretch back that far. I grew up in a home full of leaders. My parents are wonderful leaders. My older siblings are wonderful leaders, as are my younger siblings. I have 6
Yeah,
siblings.
be careful. You don't just only talk about the older ones there, right?
Yeah, although my older siblings were the ones who had kind of a leadership influence on me.
Makes
Um,
sense.
my older sister, who's a co-author on the book, was senior class president in high school, and my brother was captain of the basketball team, and
Big
they were
shoes.
big shoes, big shoes. And of course, my parents were wonderful too. My dad has done some remarkable things professionally and in our family and in our community, and my mom as well. So I grew up in a home of leaders, and so leadership has kind of been in my blood since I was a kid. But the actual impetus for this book, I think, actually, I was probably around 6 years old, or maybe a little younger than that, when my dad had an experience in his professional life. He did research on operational performance and operations strategy. And early in his career, he was studying the cement industry. You couldn't imagine a more boring industry to study.
Now, don't say that to the folks in the concrete business.
So important, though, right? Cement is it's so critical to our lives today. Anyways, he's studying cement and the performance of cement plants all across the world. And he notices in his data that there are 2 plants in exactly the same city, Midlothian, Texas, who have like incredibly different performance. I think the higher performing plant was something like 3 or 4 times more productive than the other plant. And it just like sort of intrigued him. So he decided to actually visit those plants and go and see what was going on there. And so he did. And what he found was remarkable. In the lower performing plant, he found a command and control kind of environment. And that kind of approach, which we refer to as a power over approach, right, leads to lots of different things, right? Often comes with very tall hierarchies, very narrow decision-making lanes. Power is very tightly controlled and concentrated. And the people that he saw there were just miserable at work, just very, very unhappy. Which contrasted sharply with what he saw in the other plant. The other plant was much flatter, right? I think there were only 2 or 3 levels between the plant manager and the frontline workers. People were much happier. There was a lot more initiative that people were taking in that plant. So people would see a problem, and instead of sending it up the chain, they just solve it themselves. And so effectively, so I sort of stood back and said, what's the key difference? Well, the key difference is that in the latter plant, what he saw was leadership, but not leadership emanating from the top, leadership that was everywhere in the organization, and people exercising that leadership to make things better. And the result of that ultimately was a much more productive plant, much happier people. Anyway, so that's kind of started that. If we had to sort of pinpoint where did the ideas for this book
Where does
begin?
all this come from? It goes from a long time ago.
That's it. Yeah.
I hinted at it in the open that, there are fewer and fewer people that would say the way I lead is command and control, even though there's still a whole lot of people that do. Not a lot of people say they do or want to assume or want to think that they do. And there's also lots of stuff as to why that's still more pervasive than I think most anyone would wish it to be. I'm curious. I mean, I've interviewed a lot of co-authors and chatted with lots and lots of others off camera or off mic. But I don't know that I've ever talked to someone who wrote a book with both a sibling and their father or a parent. So I'm curious sort of how that process went. I mean, because we have this same dynamic potentially of power over or leading through. So I'm just curious, like how that process went for the 3 of you, and what your experience was with that.
Well, more than a decade ago, I mean, I've been doing research similar in nature to the kind of research my dad did for about 20 years now. And I just, repeatedly in my own research observed the same things that I just described my dad observing in the cement plants. And my sister, who's a partner at Deloitte, she started a Monitor Group, which was then acquired by Deloitte.
Mm-hmm.
She was observing the same things in her clients, and eventually, about a decade ago, maybe a little more than a decade ago, we just started talking about this together, and sharing insights that we were gaining with each other, and coalescing around a set of ideas that we thought were kind of useful, potentially useful and helpful to people. And about 6 years ago, we decided that we had enough to write a book.
And then there was a pandemic.
And then there was a pandemic. Yeah, sure.
But eventually, we got this book, Leading Through, Activating the Soul, Heart, and Mind of Leadership. And it's that subtitle that's really the title of this conversation. The book covers more than just that big idea at the subtitle, but that's where we're going to focus. But before we go there, you say something in the book. You say that leaders, what leaders do, first of all, your definition of leadership is about leadership as a verb, leadership as actions, which I completely 100% agree with. And you say that leadership is about that leaders, what do leaders do? They work, mobilize, and process. Say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so we focus on leadership as work, right? I mean, that's what you were just describing. Like it's stuff that you do. It's not a position you hold or a personality characteristic you have, although maybe those things are important at some time in your leadership journey. But the leadership itself, the thing that gets people moving, is work, and we like to focus on that. It helps us to crystallize in our minds what leadership looks like, so that we can help other people learn how to do it.
If then it's behaviors, and if it's behaviors, then we can see them, we can learn from them, and therefore they are skills, and we can learn those skills, right?
Yeah. Yep. And it's an action that begets action. That's why we use that.
Say more about that.
That's why we use that term, mobilize, right? So it's not just that I'm taking action, right? It's that I'm taking action that actually leads other people to take action and to learn and to make changes in ways that make things better at the end of the day. And as we've studied that we use the word process, right? As we've studied that process repeatedly over time, we just see similarities no matter where we observe leadership, whether it's at an executive level, a team, even in a relationship between two people. Everywhere we observe leadership, we see many of the same elements. We observe fundamentally the same process playing out. And so that's why we focus on leadership as a process.
I could not possibly agree more. So you do talk about the soul of leadership, the heart of leadership, and the and the mind of leadership. And I want to talk about each of those a little bit, and sort of walk through that, thinking about what is the work of doing each of those things, right? And I'm guessing before we go too much further, most people say, well, the soul of leadership, I'm not sure how I feel about that. And if I do, I'm not sure I know what the work is there. So that's the first one in the triumvirate. And it's also the one I'd like us to start with. So what do you mean by the soul of leadership, and what should we be thinking about there?
The soul of leadership is a recognition that, in our view, leadership is always and everywhere a moral act. That's a word that we use carefully. It's a word also that gets a reaction usually from people when we use that word moral. But we really believe that it's true, that leadership is always and everywhere a moral act for the following reason. Everywhere I've observed leadership, it emerges from moments of influence, right? Somebody finds themselves in a moment, a role, a position, however that role or position comes to them, in which they have the opportunity to influence other people. And when you find yourself in that moment, the actions that you take, the things that you do, will influence those people for good or for bad. And that makes the choices you make in that moment moral. And we really think people need to think about leadership in those terms. And we also find, we believe, we sort of put a stake in the ground that leadership is good, and that great leaders always strive to make things better for other people.
So now let me ask you a question. So, because someone out there, sometime as they're listening to this, is going to say, well, if leadership is an act and not a position, that means if we're only leading if people are following, which I think you would probably agree with.
Yep.
So, okay. And so, Jonathan, I get that it ought to be a moral act, but there's been a whole lot of people that whose morals might not have matched mine that had a lot of people following them. I mean, the first name that comes to my mind is Hitler, right?
Yeah.
He clearly had people following him, a lot of them. But I think pretty much everyone would say not moral. So, like, I'm not disagreeing with anything you said. I'm not trying to be contradictory, but I do think that sometimes gets in people's way sometimes.
Yeah.
Like, so talk about how do you handle that in your thinking?
It's a great question. And there are people who, come down on both sides of this question, really smart, intelligent, great, wonderful people who come down on both sides of this question. I believe it's really important for us as purveyors of leadership, people who want to teach leadership and help people understand leadership, to be really clear about what leadership is and isn't. And followership isn't enough to produce leadership, in my view. And that's because there are lots of different things that can get people moving, lots of different things that can get people to do lots of different ways you can get people to do what you want them to do. I mean, we can go to the extreme, right? If you walk up to somebody and put a gun to their head and they do what you want them to do, is that leadership? No, they're doing what you want them to do, but I don't think anybody would call that leadership. And so we need to circumscribe, I think, what leadership is and differentiate it from other concepts like coercion, manipulation, domination. I mean, you can imagine a variety of other concepts, a variety of other ways that people can influence other people. And I think it's important for us to distinguish leadership from those things. Now, you mentioned Hitler. I think if you look at the history of Hitler's life, of course, like ultimately he did awful, horrible things. But I think, in the course of his acting to bring about those things, he actually did demonstrate some leadership along the way.
Well, I don't think there's any question, which is why I'm asking the question.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. Eventually, he kind of morphed into very, very domineering kind of approach, very coercive. I think I would use the word evil.
But that's not where he started. So I don't really want to go down that path too far, but because you've sort of answered the question. But as I think about the words coercion and domination, for example, then by the way, I'm not saying anyone who has led by a command and control, a power over approach is necessarily there. It certainly doesn't mean that they're evil by any stretch.
Right.
And yet all those words are way more connected with power over than they are leading through. Correct?
That's right. Yeah, that's absolutely right. And a point we hope comes across clear in the book is that a lot of the things that we describe as leadership nowadays are not actually leadership in our view. They are coercion and domination and power over.
Positional power and
positional
all that
power. Yes. Yep.
So I told you when we started, like, who knows where Kevin will actually go with this conversation. So I'm curious from your perspective, because I think we share a similar historical perspective here, that for our lifetimes, we're roughly the same age-ish. We get the same color hair. That the working world, those who do the work that we do to help leaders, have been trying to move away from the command and control model, and
Yeah.
that societally we've been trying to move away from the command and control model. Why has it been so hard?
Well, we've been trying to move, or some people have been trying to move away from it for more than a century. I mean, you can go
Exactly.
all the way back to Mary Parker Follett, who was warning about the dangers of coercive leadership back in the 1920s. And yet this model has persisted. I think one reason it has is that it has been able to be successful in some ways.
Or at least successful enough.
It's successful enough, exactly. Producing enough returns for shareholders, producing products that are useful and relatively inexpensive that people like to have. And so that's one reason that it's perpetuated itself. The other reason is that particular approach has infiltrated almost everything we do in society. So when you talked about me being 6 years old, when I was 6 years old, I was in first grade. When I was in first grade, nobody was teaching me leadership and initiative and creativity, and they were teaching me how to comply with authority.
Raise your hand to get
Raise your hand. That's right.
Sit in the right seat, all that stuff, right? And this is not meant to be an indictment of education.
No,
and
no,
yet
no,
you're
no.
right. It's the word that comes to my mind is it's been pervasive. And it's so seductive, because once you have that position, it's like, well, it's working well enough. And by the way, I survived it that way, and so I guess it works. And so I guess that's what I'm supposed to do too.
Yeah, people just think this is the way it works. And then they get into this mindset of, well, when is it going to be my turn? When is it going to be my turn to be in control?
Well, and then I call that the hazing scenario, right? Well, I had to survive it. I survived it. Well, they can too.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
So we've got to get, as promised in the open, everybody, that we would get to both the heart and the mind of leadership. So the heart of leadership means what?
Well, the heart is centered on an understanding that thriving organizations are created by thriving people. You're not going to have a thriving organization if your people don't thrive. You might have an organization. You might be able to accomplish some things, but your organization is not going to rise to the level of something that we would say is thriving unless the people in your organization are thriving. And that takes executives, leaders, colleagues who really care for each other and really recognize that, recognize the human element involved in organizing work. And that's what, we've forgotten. I mean, it's been, a long time since Power Over has been the dominant paradigm. And even though some elements of that paradigm have become a little bit softer and we focus a little bit more on the people, it's still, work is still pretty depersonalized. And so the heart of leadership is really about putting people back at the center of work and back at the center of organizations.
So I hinted at this in the open as well. I said that the people that have chosen to listen to this or to watch this, right, probably at some level are on board with what we're talking about. Like, chances are, unless it's someone who's really struggled and say, hey, I know I have to find another way, and they have found us for this conversation, I'm guessing, and even for those people, like, the folks who are listening likely are saying, like, I'm with you, Jonathan. Like, I get this, right? I'm with you. So my question though is give us a couple of tangible things, and there's tons of it in the book, I know, right? You talk about love and inspiration, vitality, and expression, for example, live, but give us a couple of examples of things that we could do differently or better to help lead thriving people so we can create a thriving organization.
It starts with love. That's the first thing I would say. Now, that's a very kind of abstract, generic term. And so when I say that, that's another word that actually gets a reaction. I mentioned.
Oh, yes, it does.
Moral
always does when I use it.
love gets a reaction as well. What I mean when I say love is I mean really, really caring for people, giving people attention, giving people affection, real affection, appreciation, acceptance, right? Helping people to experience those things. We don't really think about love in the workplace, but if we put it in those terms, acceptance, appreciation, affection, attention, then it becomes a little more concrete. Oh yeah, I can do that. I can pay more attention to my colleagues and their needs. I can show a little more appreciation for the things that people do for me every day. And every single one of us at work, we depend on other people. There are other people who are helping us every single day. They're a lot, enabling us to do our work and helping us to be better. We can show appreciation for those people. And so that's what I mean when I use the word love. And I think everything else flows. It flows from that. It's really, it's really an encouragement for people to make the wellness and success of other people the primary purpose of their work.
Say that one more time.
It's an invitation to make the wellness and success of other people the primary purpose of their work.
If we take care of that, take care of them, the chances that the outcomes we want will be reached goes way up.
Yep. Absolutely.
It's just where do you start, right? It's a question of where do you start.
Yeah.
So we talked about soul a little bit. We've talked about heart a little bit. And the third component is the mind of leadership. So we're getting a little less squishy now, but tell us a little bit more about that before we sort of start to wrap up here.
The mind is what makes stuff happen, right? I mean, you can have all the soul you want, all the heart you want.
Got to get something done.
If you don't know how to get stuff done, it's not going to work. It's not going to work. So the mind is really about problem solving, opportunity pursuing, decision making, team building, knowing how to interact with other people in ways that get them moving. And we use what we call the leadership process to frame the mind of leadership, to help people see that the mind of leadership is a process. It's not a nebulous thing that only a few people can come to understand. It's understandable, it's observable, it's repeatable, and it's teachable.
I would agree with that 100%. So I said at the front end that we wouldn't get to all of the book at all. And we've really focused on this front end piece of the book. And as all of us listening are practitioners, I'm presuming, of leadership, what's something, and I know there's plenty, so it's going to be a little hard to prescribe that across everywhere, but what would be one thing that you would encourage everyone to do, think about, or act on?
Oh, there's so many.
I know. So pick whatever you're led to say, just go there because it won't be wrong.
I would encourage people to focus on the soul of leadership, and specifically on striving to do what is right, to do the right thing, to do the good thing, because it's the right thing, even when it's hard. And that takes work. It takes effort to define what is it that I value. Who am I? What kind of a person do I want to be? And then strive to be that person every day.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So before we wrap up, I can probably count on a couple of hands the number of times I've gotten to this point in the conversation and felt like people already knew more about the guest than I think they know now about you. The nature of our conversation has sort of put you and who you are on display, and I mean that in the best possible way. But I would like for people to leave knowing a little bit more about you. So I've got a couple of questions that I ask everybody. And the first one is, what do you do for fun?
Less than I used to.
What is that supposed to mean?
I'm more busy than I used to be. Actually, the thing I'm doing right now for fun is I'm coaching my son's football team. He's 9 years old. He's playing tackle football for the first time. Actually, all but two of the players on his team have never played football before. And I played football when I was younger. I played a little bit in college. I love the game, and so it's really fun to teach this game to 9-year-olds and watch them get better. We won our game on Saturday, and after losing our first 6 games.
Progress.
And actually,
there's a process.
We won by 3 touchdowns. So yeah.
You didn't just eke it out. That's good. So the other thing is, and really the only thing you knew I was for sure going to ask you is, what are you reading, Jonathan?
I've been reading McKay Coppin's biography of Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney, leader to me, both because I think he's had a lot of courage in doing some things that go against his party's trends as a politician, but also because I know him personally. I grew up in the same town where he raised his family. I know his sons, and so I'm taking the opportunity to get to know Mitt Romney a little bit better.
From a slightly different lens.
Different perspective, yeah.
Different way. Well, that's cool.
Yeah.
That's awesome. We'll have that in the show notes for everybody. You can get a link to that. But we're also going to obviously give people a link to this book, Leading Through, Activating the Heart, Soul, and Mind of Leadership. Where do you want to point people, Jonathan? Where can people learn more about your work? You, Dad, and Sis's work, this book, where do you want to point people?
Well, people can go to our website. We've got a website that introduces the book. It's leadingthrough.co. And of course, you can, wherever your favorite bookseller is, you can go there and the book's available.
It is. And as of us having this conversation, been available for a couple of weeks, which is really exciting. So before we say goodbye, I need to ask a question of the group, of the audience, of all of you listening. It's the same question if you've been here before. You know what I'm going to ask you. Now what? What action are you going to take as a result of being here? What did you take from this that you won't just find sort of intellectually interesting or stimulating, but rather what action will you take as a result? Now, certainly, both Jonathan and I would love for you to go get a copy of his new book. But beyond that, what ideas did you get today that you want to take some action on? Maybe there's action that you want to take around this idea of recognizing that your action is begetting the action of others. And how is that aligned with what you want? Maybe it's you were challenged to think about something that you need to be doing the right thing. And that's been a struggle for you of late. Maybe it's this idea of leadership as a moral act. I don't know what it is. Those are just a few of the things that I wrote down. It doesn't matter what I wrote. It doesn't even matter what you wrote. What matters is what action that you take, because as we said from the beginning, leadership is a verb. It's something that we do. There's work here to do. And I hope that this show and every episode helps you do that work better. Jonathan, thanks so much for being here. It was such an absolute pleasure to have you. I've enjoyed our time a great deal.
Me too. Thank you, Kevin. Appreciate the opportunity.
My pleasure. So everybody, if you like this, you better come back next week because we're going to be here again. And so you might as well join us. So wherever you're watching this from, make sure you're subscribed. You are subscribed, and make sure you tell someone else to join us, because if you do, you will be continuing on your journey to be a more effective leader, to become perhaps even a remarkable leader. I hope that you will join us then for another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast.